All right, let's go ahead and get started with the fifth Reason Prep live stream. My name is Rob Shums. I'm the founder of Reason Prep, the voice and the face behind the videos, and I'm here today to answer questions on the SAT and the ACT, among other things. I'm guessing, given that the SAT is on Saturday, that we're going to be focusing mostly on SAT stuff, but I will take questions on anything. The goal for the session is probably about an hour, but we'll see. I may duck out early. I'm kind of tired. I've got a lot of stuff going on, obviously, before the test. It's always a busy week. And I'm going to, regardless of how long we go on today, I'm going to have another session tomorrow at 8 o'clock. So live stream number 6 will be Friday at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to try to get to as many questions as I can. If I can't get to everything, I'll try to get to them Friday, and hopefully we can hit everything there as well. As always, if you have questions, send an email to ask@reasonprep.com. That's usually the best way to send me questions. You can also ask questions in chat. That's fine as well. But if you can send them to me, especially if it's a question like from a problem, so that you can send me the image and, most importantly, the answer, so I don't have to look up the answer, and then source of the question if possible. So send questions to ask@reasonprep.com. I'll also take questions in chat as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I got some questions ahead of time. So these first few questions are going to be from real SATs. So if you haven't done these, I recommend just kind of checking out, not watching this, so that this question, so that you don't get spoiled on this, because you should do this on your own before you really check out my solutions. So this comes from SAT number 6, their sixth test they've released, from the no calculator section. And I grimaced at this question because it's just such a pain. And so let's go through it. How many liters of a 25% saline solution must be added to 3 liters of a 10% saline solution to obtain a 15% saline solution? So the idea here is to keep track of your percentages. Let's begin with our 3 liters of a 10% saline solution. We can determine from this how many liters of saline there are. We just take 10% of 3. So 3 times 0.10. So this is telling us in this part of the mixture, we have 0.3 liters of saline. Now, let me just flip over to this. Okay. Now, we're going to mix this with a certain number of liters. Let's call that X, because that's what we're trying to find. X liters of a 25% solution. And when we do all that, we're going to form a 15% solution of saline. So what we want to do here is set up a fraction, because if you think of percent saline, essentially what that is, it's the liters of saline over the total liters of solution. So in the first case, here we know 0.3 of our solution is saline, and that is out of the 3 liters of solution. So I'm going to put these numbers, 0.3 liters of saline over 3 liters of solution, as part of my total mixture. But what's the other part of the mixture I'm adding in here? I'm adding in X liters of 25% saline. So I'm going to add another X liters to this solution. How much of that is saline? Well, that saline must be 25% of this X. So I would multiply 0.25 times X. And so that would get me the amount of saline in that part of the solution. And so when I add these two solutions together, I'm going to mix the total saline together. Let me just get rid of these L's so they don't think we're variables here. I'm going to mix the amount of saline I have over the total liters of solution. And this should equal 0.15. It should equal 15%. And I'm not going to complete the solution here because at this point it's trivial. Just cross multiply, calculate X. I think you get X as 1.5 or something like that. I don't have the exact answer on hand, but you can complete it from here. The setup is the hard part. And you want the liters of saline over the total liters of solution. Once you set that up with your X's, you can get the answer. I don't know if there's an easier way to do this. There probably would be. Maybe just a thing to memorize. So maybe I'll think about maybe a memorization way to tackle this. Maybe weighted average, maybe. But anyway, that's the way I know of it, of doing this one now. So I'll leave it at that. Anyone who wants to follow up, especially the person who asked this question, feel free. Okay, how do you interpret old texts on the SAT? So unfortunately, this is a really big question because it's basically like how do we read old history passages, and it depends on the passage. Um, it's almost like a different language when you're dealing with old history texts because you're dealing with 19th century English or 18th century English. So it would be like if I asked you, like, how do I read Spanish texts? You have any tips? It's like an impossible question to answer. It's like first you have to know the language and then you have to go through the reading process of it. I'll just repeat what I've said before about this. Focus on the questions. Use the questions to help guide you on what you need to pay extra attention to. Don't think you need to understand absolutely every single word and every single sentence of that history passage. In the end, you have to understand what the questions ask you to understand. So use the questions to guide the way you read the passage and guide what you're paying the most attention to. Okay, question about, this is somewhat unrelated to SAT, but also kind of related, so we'll cover this one now. So this is a question about the difference between SAT math and SAT subject test level 1 math. So they're pretty similar. I would say the math on SAT level 1 is harder. It's essentially equivalent to Algebra 2. I would say it's about as high as it goes. Algebra 2. More trig on it, more tricky word problems, just generally harder. But if you've done Algebra 2, you should be good to go for it. At least you should have studied everything for it. Whereas SAT does include some Algebra 2, but it's a lot more of like Algebra 1, especially linear equations. A lot more of percents and, pre-algebra stuff you might have learned in middle school. So the math content is easier than what's on the subject test level 1, and much more algebra. No, probably even in algebra, but generally this is going to be harder. It's more Algebra 2 stuff you would have learned there. There's a little bit of that on the SAT, but generally the SAT goes a little bit easier than that. Do you know if the website Crack ACT is using good materials that I can practice with? So Crack ACT, very common thing people like to use. Got a lot of practice tests on it. What's good about it are the real tests. So if you're using tests that are real, they're usually the dated tests like June 2010 or anything like that, especially the more recent ones. Those are good to use. Whatever other materials they have on that site, books and other scans, other like practice questions kind of randomly associated on the site, that goes with the same story as any third-party material, which is it's not going to be as good as real tests. So use the real tests. I would avoid all the other stuff. Also, technically, I guess I shouldn't really be endorsing this too much because it is technically a copyright violation, not only of the tests, but also of the books that they have on that site. So if you can get your hands on real tests, that's what you should use. Third-party stuff like books, Princeton Review, Barron's, it's good for additional extra practice, but especially for reading and science, the focus should be on real tests. So use real tests and you should be good. Which test is Test 8? So the SAT recently released Test 8 on their website and on Khan Academy, so you can download that there. I'm not sure if you mean by this like which test, like the March test or something. It might be the March test. I don't know which one it is exactly, but it was a previously administered test, or at least part of it is. So it's download on College Board or Khan Academy. It's an official test, definitely a good one to do. I'm actually just right now finishing video solutions, which I'm going to post hopefully tonight or very early tomorrow. Video solutions to math, reading, and writing from this test. The writing ones will be available free in my course. The math and the reading solutions are available in my math and reading courses on my website, reasonprep.com. Let's go back to some emails here. Okay, number 37, SAT Practice 6. So again, this comes from the Practice Test 6. So if you haven't done this test yet, I would just kind of not pay attention to this so you don't get spoiled. And so the question was 37. And the question was using the exponential growth formula for this. When I did the explanation for this on my site, which is what the genesis of this question is, I didn't use it because I don't think you need to. The easiest way to do this is just to write it out. I will show you the exponential growth in a second, but I think it's overkill. We started in 2005. We have $480, and each year it doubles. So if I want to go back to the amount in the account in 2001, I just need to go back and half this each time. So in 2004, I must have had half of this, half, half, half. And let me just check that that's the answer. But long story short, you're going to get 30 just by writing it out. You don't even need to use the exponential growth formula. Now, the question was, what do you do if you want to use the exponential growth formula? So I'll show that to you. Is it easier? It might be easier. Well, no, it's not going to be easier, but it'll be, I don't think, too bad to use that. So let me just check, make sure I did this right. Yeah. So exponential growth formula is a times 1 plus r over n to the nt. In this case, we're doing an annual, so we just need to do 1 plus r to the t. Now, in this case, the question is, what's the r? And they don't tell you this, which is why it's somewhat hard to use this formula here. But if it's doubling, you're increasing by 100%. So what this ends up turning into is 1 plus 1 to the t, or 2 to the t, and this equals 480. So, yeah, this is where it gets kind of annoying. Would this actually work? Right, I guess if 5... Yeah, you know what? I'm not even going to do this because it's just so complicated. There's really no reason to do it. Just write out the actual doublings, and it's much easier than doing this. I'd have to think about how to do this. You can use the exponential growth formula, but it's not immediately obvious. Oh, right, you would need to know, you would need to know the initial, so we would put an A out front here. Like I said, rather confusing. If the person who emailed me this question wants to follow up with me on this, I'll talk to you about it, but I don't think it is really very valuable to go much further into this method when the first method is so much easier. When doing the reading section on the new SAT, when you read the passage, should you just summarize each paragraph or anything else to look for and how? So a lot of this gets into my reading passage strategy. I actually, in the previous live stream, talked about this. I gave a general outline. So if you look up live stream highlights number 4, I give an outline of my reading passage strategy. To answer the first question, no, I don't think it's actually useful at all to summarize each paragraph or to annotate each paragraph or underline or mark up. None of that stuff is super useful because in the end, if it doesn't help you answer questions, it's a waste of time and energy. The focus should be on questions. So the gist of the way I approach SAT passages is as you read the passage, you're doing the questions specific to general. So you're essentially reading the passage in chunks in order to answer specific questions as you work through them. So I don't recommend, for example, reading through the entire passage before you go to the questions, or reading through the entire passage and marking it up, or summarizing paragraphs, annotating it. Generally not a great use of time. Now, that said, if you do that and you do well, go for it. But I'm really speaking to those people out there who don't really have a strategy, don't really want a place to start with a strategy. And as I recommend, you read the passage as you answer the questions, and you develop then a sense of what's going on in the passage as you do that. SAT, yeah. So the SAT 8, the date, I don't know what it is. Maybe March. I don't know. Maybe if someone else out there who knows would be able to say. I'm guessing it's March, since that was like 2 weeks ago. Also, is that all you do when reading first, or do you try and do the specific questions? I guess this is in reference to the previous question. Yeah, we do specific questions first for SAT reading, and then we do general questions after that. Should we review old tests the day before the test? It depends on what you mean by review. If it just means like reading them and like looking them over, it's probably not a great use of time. If it means redoing questions that you got wrong the first time, that might be useful. Specifically doing it the day before the test, I don't think is super necessary. Like cramming the day before the test is probably not a great idea. You should probably spend maybe a little time preparing, but really the day before the test should mostly be spent relaxing. Because if you cram and work hard the day before the test, you tire yourself out for the test day, which is Saturday. Not a great idea. So you can do a little bit of prep, but really the heavy lifting should be done now or much prior to the test. The day before should be, in the best scenario, left to relaxing, getting rest so that you're fresh for Saturday's test. In terms of reviewing old tests, yeah, as long as you're like doing the questions again, that's a good idea, especially ones you got wrong. But just like reading the tests and kind of generally flipping through them, probably not a high value use of time. Okay, so I got a question. I don't know the source of, whoa, that's really big. I don't know the source of this. So I don't know if this is from an SAT 1 or an SAT 2 or what. And I haven't really looked at this one yet, so maybe there's an easier way to do this. But basically, we want to know for this question, what is the value of A? And the gist of the question, I think this is what might help students just in general on this, is what's the topic and how do you solve this? So when you look at questions like this, you want to ask yourself, what is the possibilities of what I could use to solve this question? And there's really only a couple things. One, since we've got a bunch of right triangles, is Pythagorean Theorem. And I think that's going to be pretty useful here. And maybe as well slopes of lines, since I've got a line here, maybe something to do with the slope. I don't know. But that's really it. So since we're in the realm of Pythagorean Theorem, we've got to use one of those. So I'm just going to fill in some info here. This is going to have a height of A, and I know this is 3. So this whole thing is 9 units long. And this whole thing is 8 plus A units long. And you know what? I probably should have done this one before because I don't know the source of this. If this is like an SAT 2, having to do this one right now might be complicated because it's looking to be somewhat complicated to me. Involving slopes of lines, and I know this is 10 because it's a 6, 8, 10 triangle. Yeah, I'm going to take a pass on this one. I think the person who emailed me directly, I'm going to just contact them about this one because I'm going to have to think about this one. It's not immediately obvious what to do, and this may not even be an SAT 1 question. It doesn't look like it. It looks harder. But I think the general lesson is it's going to have something to do with Pythagorean theorems, probably something to do with slope. But like I said, I'm going to take a pass on this because this looks like it's going to get super complicated, and I don't think it's very helpful for people to see this one. But whoever emailed this to me, I'll email you back about it directly. All right, next question. Also about SAT reading, which I'm guessing is going to be the hot topic for all kinds of reasons. Generally, it's the section that people have the most trouble with. So I know that we should start with the easiest passage in the SAT reading, for example. I find it the science passages. When some tests, the science is the hardest, even harder than the literature and history. That affects my time, so what should I do to solve the problem? So yeah, it's a trend, right? Sometimes, yeah, like the science passage, if you find that generally easier, sometimes it ends up being the hard one. And there's no way to predict that. But that's why we do trends, right? Most of the time, the science will be easier for you. So therefore, we will do it first. Most of the time, maybe this applies to you, it applies to many students, most of the time the history will be the hardest, so we tend to do that last. Sure, there's going to be some variation, there's no way to predict it, but I would rather go in knowing, okay, I'm going to do what generally is easier for me first and leave what's generally harder for me last. Sometimes that gets messed up because sometimes the science actually ends up being really hard and maybe the history is actually easier, but it's a trend, right? Rather than what's the alternative? The alternative is just to do them in order. Well, what's the point of that? Doing them in order, we're just kind of leaving up to complete chance what's easy, medium, or hard. And we also know that the history passage, for example, is going to be like hard no matter what. So maybe don't worry so much about which ones to do first. It's more important which ones to do last. So history passage last, dual passage last, fiction passage last. Whatever's hard for you, do that at the end, and then anything else left, do that first. So yeah, you might get some variance, but I think it's much better than just kind of doing it randomly in order, just because that's the way it's presented. So this is another question about reading, about the two-part questions. So as you probably know, there are questions on the SAT that require you to bring this down, to do 2 parts. So you've got to answer the question and then provide evidence for it. And this is a question related to that. For the evidence questions in SAT reading, why should I not start with part 2? I'm aware that sometimes when you get the wrong answer in 2, part 1's wrong, but sometimes solving 2 will help me finish both parts faster. So this gets into the specifics of the strategies that I talk about in my reading course about how to tackle the 2-part questions. The gist of it, and I go into more detail there, is when you've got those 2-part questions, let me actually get an example one out to illustrate this. So this is from a random test. We're not actually going to do the question. I'm just using it as an example. So what I generally recommend is to do the first question first on its own, as if there were no part two. And then usually when you get the answer to this one, you can say to yourself, okay, what evidence in the passage led me to this answer? Because that's always how it should be, right? You always should be getting evidence, something you can point to in the passage that leads you to the answer to any reading question, much less a question like this. And then usually if you say, okay, I got the answer here as B, and I saw that in line 79 or something, well, that basically answers part two instantly for you. That's the best thing to do. Now, generally, I don't recommend starting from these lines and then trying to find the answer. Now, in response to your specific question, yeah, sometimes it can work out for you to start with these and then use those to find the answer, but it can also lead to danger. So try to do it on its own first. If you're having problems, then look at the lines and see if it helps. The problem where students get into with doing it that way, though, which is why I warn against it, almost as a last-ditch effort you can do it, is too often what students will just do is they'll read this line, they'll read these lines, read these lines, read these lines out of context, just kind of reading them separately, and then try to match them to choices. And that's really dangerous because they're going to have, let's say A is wrong, but maybe A lines up with A in 31, which is also wrong. So if you see that they connect, you might be tempted to say, oh, look, A and A, those connect together, so that's the answer. But that's totally irrelevant to answering the question. So the danger with starting with these choices is just kind of out of context, linking them with choices up here, and then having that help you answer the question, because a lot of times that's going to lead you to traps. It's much better to read the passage as it is, find the answer as best you can here, and then these lines usually drop out pretty easily. So I go into a lot more detail about this in the course, but that's the general reason why I recommend do this first and then do that one, rather than doing this to help you find this. It's much better to go the other way around. Another question follow-up about reading. So when you're reading, you shouldn't read all the questions, but do them one at a time. But if you see a question that's general, then you should skip. Yes, that's exactly right. No need to read all the questions in advance. You basically just look at the first question. Is it general? If yes, skip. If it's specific, do it. Look at the next question. Is it general? Yes, no. If it's specific, do it. If it's general, skip. So you'll do all the specifics first. As you're doing those specifics, you read through the passage, kind of in chunks to answer those questions. By the time you finish all those specifics, you'll have read the entire passage, then go back and do the general questions. That is, in essence, the way to tackle reading passages. Question about SAT essay. In the SAT essay, sometimes it is very hard to find 3 rhetorical strategies, so I tend to choose somehow general and weak rhetorical strategy to save time. So what should I look for to find the most important 3 rhetorical strategies? So there's no passage is going to be the same, so I can't say here are the 3 strategies that you'll always find, or here is what you should always look for to find the 3 strategies, because they're all different. What's important is to know what strategies exist. So in the essay course, I actually have a list. If you're not enrolled already, I've got a free SAT essay course on my site. Goes through everything you need to know for SAT essay and includes some cheat sheets and worksheets and helpful stuff. And one of the things it includes is a list of rhetorical strategies that you can look at. And you want to learn that list because you want to be able to read the passage looking for things like that. So I can't tell you the 3 things to look for, like what will help you find the most important 3 strategies. Learn the list. Know, for example, in evidence that in the evidence category, that it can be things like statistics, it can be scientific studies and citations, it can be quotes from people, it can be experimental evidence, data, whatever it might be, facts of some kind. Those would be useful things to look for. In logical reasoning, could be things like cause and effect, analogies, reasoning from specifics to general or general to specific. I go through all these in that resource. In the persuasive elements category, it's things like appeal to emotion, appeal to authority, exaggeration, understatement, vivid language, tone. So you need to know these so that when you're reading through the passage, you're on the hunt for them. You're on the lookout. If you don't know what these strategies could be, it's hard to find them. So that's the thing I would do here is make sure you learn, memorize, whatever. those list of strategies. It's not everything. There are other strategies that are not on that list, but it's a really handy thing that you'll be able to find basically enough for any passage that you're looking for. I think a equals 4 because we can use a ratio of 10 to x and 6 to 3. Yeah, so similar triangles to that previous question might work out. That should probably is the best way to do it, actually. It's a good idea. But yeah, I think, 10 to 6 and x to 3. That's 5, that's 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that might work. So going back to this one, that's actually a good point. Similar triangles might also be helpful here. This is where it helps to know where this question comes from, which is why I ask for the source. Because if you know this is SAT 1, for example, you know your only options are Pythagorean Theorem, slope, and similar triangles. That's about it. If this is SAT 2 Math 2 subject test, then potentially other things might come into play, involving trigonometry and things like that. So once you know it's maybe more SAT 1, it really limits the scope of what to look for, and then, you can go back and see, is it Pythagorean theorem? There could be a way to do it that way. Is it going to be similar triangles, which, makes sense here as well. Maybe there are other ways, but absolutely having an idea of the limits of what they can ask you about can help you for questions like that. Okay, let's see what else we got here. So I was sent some questions. These look familiar to me. Was this... First off, whoever sent these questions, so questions from June 2016, if you could pick a question, number one. Number two, give me the answers, because I don't know what the answers are to these. And then I'll be happy to do them. But otherwise, I got to look up what the answers are, and that just takes forever. Just re-email me with which question you want to look at and the answer to the question. What can we do in the last day before the SAT exam, Friday? So it's really hard to answer this question because I don't know what you've done so far. I don't know what your scores are, what your goals are. So I can't give really specific advice, unfortunately. I wish I could. But it's just this question could be different for 10 different people. The one thing that I think all people can do, regardless of where you're at, and I mentioned this before, is you have to have some element of relaxation in the day before the test. If you spend the entire day cramming, or worse, I see this way too often. People say, I stayed up until 2 studying. That's a disaster. The amount of stuff you'll learn in that time period will be completely dwarfed by the fact that you're sleep deprived and not thinking straight the day after. So absolutely do not stay up late studying. Do not cram. Spend at least some time, no matter where you're at, relaxing, watching a movie, doing whatever you do to relax, exercising, playing a sport, whatever it is, hanging out with friends. You got to get your mind off the test, because that is when, during the process of relaxing, and then also, most importantly, getting sleep, that's when your brain consolidates whatever it is you've learned so that you can use it on test day. So I can't give much more specific thing than that, except for everybody should have some element of relaxing. If you spend the entire day cramming, I guarantee you'll probably be worse off than better, because you'll just be drained and tired, and you're not giving yourself some time to shut down and figure everything out. So the main thing would be to spend some time relaxing on some level and get a good night's sleep. Okay, more questions here. In the planning part of the essay, I find that searching for the main idea and rhetorical strategy at the same time can save time. Any disadvantages for doing so? No, I think that's fine. There's a certain element in which they both relate to one another, right? The strategies that the author uses to make their point necessarily relate to the point that they're making. So, in fact, not just are there no disadvantages, I think there are advantages to doing that, because there is that interplay. Whatever the author is trying to argue will depend on the strategies that they're using to argue that. So absolutely, that's something you can do. Again, for those of you who aren't really familiar with anything of what we're talking about here, I've got my SAT essay course available for free, reasonprep.com. I go through all of this, explain exactly how to tackle the essay, finding rhetorical strategies, main idea, summary, analysis, all that kind of stuff. So check that out there. But yeah, this seems like a good idea. So I've got a specific quick grammar question here too. Audience, a company of adults at the stadium, which is correct. A company of adults or a company of adults. So they're probably, again, it depends on the full sentence, but almost always those are going to be interchangeable. So having a dash around each part of that phrase, so dash here and a dash here, or a comma here and a comma here, basically the same. Again, it depends exactly on the sentence. Maybe there's a slight difference that might maybe lead us one toward the other. I would be surprised. Most of the time on the SAT and the ACT, dash dash or comma comma around a positive like this are essentially equivalent. They're both fulfilling the same functions. In real life, there is more of a difference. Just on the SAT and ACT, there's not. In real life, there's more of a difference in emphasis. So when you use dashes, you're putting more emphasis on that phrase, whereas commas downplay the phrase a bit more. But that's not really something they're going to test on the SAT or ACT. So for all intents and purposes, again, depending with the caveat of sometimes weird things happen in specific questions, dash dash comma comma are equivalent. So you're never going to have to choose between them. On the other hand, dash comma or comma dash is never right because you got to be consistent. Either you use two dashes or two commas, one or the other, but you don't mix and match. That's for sure. Okay, so I think that is it for the emailed questions that I've had. And looks like we're slowing down in chat. So I'll stick around for a little bit longer, but if there are no more questions, I'm going to bounce early. Because like I said, super busy right now, a few days before the test. We will be having another live stream on tomorrow, Friday, right before the test. So as I was saying before, if you're studying, you might want to pop in for this, ask a few more questions, and then you can, depending on the time of day this is for you, you can just relax after that once you get your questions answered. But yeah, I'll have another session on Friday at 8 o'clock Eastern time at night. Let's say PM. And so if you're subscribed to my YouTube channel or on my Facebook group or on my email list, you'll get announcements about this. And so yeah, feel free to stop by, ask questions then. But like I said, if there are no other, I'll give it another 5-ish minutes. And if there are no more questions, then we'll wrap up for today. Let's make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, another reading question. And as always, it's hard to give great answers without having specific passages, because this is a question about basically main idea, which choice best summarizes the passage's main argument. So I can't give you a step-by-step procedure because it depends on every single passage is different, but I can give you a few things to look for. The first thing to not get tripped up by is don't get tricked by choices that mention passage details. So often what they have on these questions is they'll have one, maybe two choices which mention something that was in the passage, but why they don't end up being correct is because they're details mentioned in the passage. They don't capture the main argument. You want a choice, and this gets into the second point. You want the choice, the right answer will cover the most the highest ratio of the passage. So in other words, the right answer, instead of just being about a detail, which sure maybe is in the passage but is not the main idea, is going to summarize the most of the passage that's possible. Maybe not everything that's in the passage, but a good chunk of it, right? More than half, certainly. So the trap choices are going to be things that are in the passage, but it doesn't matter if it's in the passage if it's not a main idea. The focus is on the main idea. So get something that's more summary, that's more about the passage as a whole, rather than a detail here or a detail there. Now, of course, the answer has got to be based on the passage on some level, but don't get sucked into those choices which mention a word or a phrase or an idea. It's got to be something in the passage as a whole. Okay, so this was more, it seemed to be about in the writing passage. So that was for the reading passage. What about in the writing? The writing for SAT, you will very, very rarely see this. In fact, can I even think of one that does? But even if you did, the same lessons would be true there as well. Don't get sucked into one fragment of something mentioned somewhere in the passage. It's got to cover the majority of the passage as a whole, not just a small piece of it. Do you think your test explanations of test 8 will go up today? So, as I said earlier, I am doing video solutions for test 8. And so this will be SAT 8, math, reading, and writing. The writing will be available for free in my writing course. The math and the reading are available in the math and reading courses, which are only on my site. The goal is I finished recording all the videos. I just need to edit them. That will probably take me an hour or two. And then I got to post them. And as soon as they're posted, I'll send out an email about it to people who are signed up to my site. So the goal is, yes, I will have them up. No promises, though. I mean, I don't see how I can't do it. I've got some other things going on later, but I'm going to probably stay up a little bit to get it done. So the answer is yes. Just keep an eye out on your email. They'll definitely be up before the test. That's for sure. So certainly before later tomorrow, they'll be up. So that's the plan. They will be up today. So I do have video solutions in my courses for all 8 SATs released by the College Board: math, reading, and writing. So if you want to learn more, go to Reason Prep, or just go to members.reasonprep.com. You'll find out all about my courses and other stuff available there, including solutions to all these questions. Okay. I heard that in the SAT March trial in the United States, they added additional reading section. Is that true? And if it's true, will it be applied in all trials? My guess is what this is referring to is the experimental section. So what they've done, they said they weren't going to do this, but because they've gone back on it, I wouldn't see how they wouldn't be able to do this. It makes sense that they would go back and do it. It just thinks that they have to. Basically what happens is, I believe it's only in the United States. I don't think they're doing this internationally, but we'll see. If you're not taking the essay, what they have you do is stay after section 4 and have you do a section 5. Now here's the thing. It doesn't count towards your score. It could be a math, it could be a reading, it could be a writing. It doesn't count towards your score. So as soon as you finish section 4, the math, no math calculator permitted, your test is done. However, again, if you're not taking the essay, they may have you take an additional section. We call this the experimental section. Essentially, they use this to test future questions. They use it for statistical gobbledygook. It doesn't count towards your score. Now, they kind of don't want you to know that, because if you know that, then you don't try as hard on it, and the data they get from it is not as accurate. But that's the way it is. They may not advertise to you that, oh, this is fake, this is just for us, don't worry about it. They want you to be as realistic as you can with it. So I would not say to bomb it. Don't just put nothing for it, because you don't want to just draw any attention to your test. So do try on it to some extent, but it's not going to count. So don't freak out if it's weird, if it's different than anything you've ever seen. It doesn't count. It's just their way of testing new questions. So do it, but do it with the safety that it's not going to affect you in any way. Should I do test 8 today for practice, or should I not do test prep 2 days before? I studied consistently for the 4 months up to now. So you've done a lot of work already. Again, cramming may not really be much useful. You have to ask, like, what's the value of doing that in the last 2 days? So if you've studied up to now, then I think what you can do in the last day/2 is do what you're doing now, watch these live streams, get any questions you have answered, maybe do some light practice in maybe your weakest section, or review something that you need to review. But doing like a full test is probably not a good idea. So sitting down like tomorrow especially and doing a full 4-hour test, 3-hour test, I definitely don't recommend that. So you can, if you want, maybe break it up, maybe do just the reading section, or maybe do some of the math problems, maybe do some of the hardest math problems or something. It's up to you. So I would say don't do a full test, but it's not going to be the end of the world if you don't do anything, because you've studied up for 4 months up to now. It's probably best to relax. But if you want to do something, maybe break it up a little bit, do some questions, do a section or two. But I wouldn't do the whole thing, like sitting there like a real test, because you're going to be doing that on Saturday, and you want to be as fresh as possible. How to make ratios for similar triangles. So what you want to look for, let's say we have 2 triangles. This is a general thing we can talk about. Let's say we've got 2 triangles. They look like this. And we're going to call them ABC and DEF. And we want to set up proportions in these triangles. The first thing we need to do is determine which sides are corresponding, which sides link to one another. And the first thing is, either we're told these are similar, or we determine through various means that the 3 angles of the triangles are congruent. So pink equals pink, green equals green, blue equals blue. Once we see that, this is the angle-angle theorem of similarity, we know these triangles are similar. And now we know we can set up proportions. So what you need to pay attention to, it's kind of 2 ways to look at it to find corresponding sides. Either for a given side, let's say side AC, look at the angles that it's associated with, that it's kind of made up of, the pink and the blue, and the side in the other triangle will be the one that is pink and blue. So AC corresponds to DF because they're both the pink and the blue side. Or you can look at the angle across from the side, which is probably easier. So the side across from the green angle corresponds. So AC to DF, AB and DE, and then BC and EF would be corresponding. So when you're looking for corresponding sides, you actually pay attention to angles. That tells you which sides link up. And then once you've done that, you can create all kinds of ratios. So you could do AC is to DF as AB is to DE, or BC is to EF. Or you could mix the triangles together. You could do AC is to BC, so basically the green angle to the pink angle, as DF is to EF. So again, green to pink. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the key is to find those corresponding sides in the first place. And then once you do that, just be consistent with the ordering. Either put the same triangle in one fraction, or put the same triangle on the top and the bottom. Be consistent. Follow up, what if those triangles are inside each other? It's the same idea. So this is actually often what you'll see on the SAT. Let me actually save this and then make a new one, because we are out of room. So the question about similar triangles, what if they are inside each other? So let's say I had something like this and something like this. Same thing applies. You have to find the corresponding angles or corresponding sides. So let's say we had A, B, C, D, E. We know For example, let's say these are both right angles. So we'll call those our red angles. We know they both share this angle A, right? Triangle ADE and ABC both have this angle A, so that's the same. And we know, therefore, that these angles, make these blue, must then be congruent. Because once you found two angles are congruent, you know the third has to come along for the ride because the three angles have got to add up to 180. So what do you do in this situation? It's the same thing. What sides would be corresponding? So I could do AE is to AB. This is the side across from the blue angle, AE and AB, as let's say DE is to BC, so the two sides across from the green angle, right? It's the same thing. Just pay attention to where your angles are and find which ones correspond based on which ones they're across from or which ones they're composed of. So like BE is across from the green, but it's also in between blue and red. It just depends on how you like looking at it. I like doing it across from the angles. It's usually easier to follow. Is 1400 generally a good score in the SAT? Yeah, I mean, obviously good is relative. If you're going for Harvard, then 1400 is probably not enough. Depends, obviously. But for most schools, 1400 is great. So yeah, it's good. Can't say much more than that. Certainly well above average. If you're curious how good it is, you can look up percentiles. So percentiles will tell you basically how it compares to the student population. Now these percentiles might be somewhat old, but they're at least a good measure. So 1400, actually no, that won't help. Would this be it? Let's do this. So let's do SAT percentiles. Just Google SAT percentiles and then this looks fine. So 1400 is approximately like, that can't be right, 96th percentile, that's way too high. Let's find this. So here we are, perfect. So 1400, according to the College Board, is, oh, okay, it's close, 94th percentile. So if you're a 1400 or above, your score beats 94% of the students who take the test, pretty much, which is really good. Can you cancel your SAT score after the following Wednesday? I don't know how score cancellation works, so I would just check with the College Board, go to their website, look up canceling scores. My guess is there's some time limit to it. I don't know what the timeline is, so I would check with the College Board because I don't know exactly. And even if I knew the answer, I would still say go to the College Board because it changes and there's different policies. So just check with them and they'll be able to tell you. Okay. How many trials can I make for the SAT-1? So there's no real limit. I mean, I guess there's a practical and financial limit, but in most cases, if you take it, there's no hard limit to say, oh, only take it twice or only take it 3 times. I think just for your sanity and so that it doesn't look ridiculous, you probably should do 3 is a good number, but I don't want to say if you take it 4 or 5 times, you're going to be in trouble. Most of the time, colleges just want to see your highest score. Where it could hurt is like if you take the SAT 8 times and then your application is thin elsewhere, that's when you get into problems, right? So take it a reasonable number of times. I think 2 or 3 is usually the standard, and that's usually a good amount. But if you take it 4 or 5 times or whatever, it's not a huge deal. But, just focus on quality rather than quantity. Put in the time and effort to prep for a test. Don't just kind of spam tests to get a bunch of reps in there. Take it as often as you can, while also putting in the time between tests to put in your studying. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left is the maximum, so if anyone wants to ask any more questions, I'd be happy to respond. But if no other questions get asked, I will end it. And at the most, I'll end it at 6 o'clock, or in 10 minutes anyway. So feel free to ask more questions if you've got them. So a few other notes before we start wrapping up, since this doesn't look like we're getting more questions. We'll have another of these sessions tomorrow, 8 o'clock. So if you have any additional questions you want to ask or any last minute stuff, we can go through it there. Recording of this will be up on YouTube basically right after we finish. And I'm going to eventually, probably not, maybe sometime this weekend, I'll put up highlights to these live streams. I'll probably combine them, frankly, to just make it one video. Highlights for streams 5 and 6. And so the highlights will be there. And yeah, I'll be doing one tomorrow, probably more live streams the week after, and just continuing on. So if you missed this one and you're taking the test in June, or if you're taking it in the fall or whatever, we're going to have plenty of these, so you should get plenty of time to see these. Okay, so I'm going to call it there since we are looking to be drying up on questions. Like I said, we'll have another session tomorrow, so I look forward to talking to you all then. Thanks so much for your questions and for participating, and I'll see you next time.